tell Daniel and I would be fighting over the microphone today. Sorry, Daniel. When we hear the stories from the Gospels, we're hearing a story that somebody has made a record from Jesus' life. And if we want to know something about Jesus' life, of course, that is where we go. Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And the Gospels are actually even more than that. We know that the earliest Gospel, Mark, was written at least a generation after the death of Jesus. And some of the Gospels came even 2 generations after the death of Jesus. So they are not simply stories to help the church learn about the life of their founder. They are also stories to help the church learn about its own life and the dreams their founder, Jesus the Christ, might have had for them in their life. Today's gospel, in the Gospel of Matthew, is one of the few places where the gospel writer focuses really specifically on how Christians are called to live, how they're called to live in community with their fellow Christians, with life in the church. Scholars call this passage from Matthew a commentary on church discipline. So if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault of that one when the 2 of you are alone. And if the member listens, you have regained that one. So what do we do in the church if all is not well and we have an issue with another person in the church? Well, according to the Gospel of Matthew, we go directly to that person and talk about whatever the issue is. And it seems pretty self-evident. Most of us learn this at our mother's knees or in preschool or in kindergarten. Go talk to the person you have a problem with. But what is it that we actually do when we have a problem with someone else? I know the easiest way to deal with it is to go tell someone else, right? It's so much easier to talk to someone who has a sympathetic ear, who will reinforce your sense of being wronged, than it is to talk to the actual person involved, a person who's probably not going to have such a sympathetic ear when you go directly one-on-one to that person. Also, instinctively, I think, when we have some conflict between us and another person, another Christian or a person in our church, you know what we really want? We don't want to be listened to necessarily. We want the offender to agree with us. And we want them to do what we think is right or best. Agree and comply with our recommendations for action. Listen to feeling heard, that's nice. But really being agreed with and obeyed, much better, huh? So in that case, we instinctively keep quiet because we fear that our hoped-for outcome, instead of the hoped-for gospel outcome, may not actually occur. So we just button it down. Our ease at falling into speaking to a third party about our church conflicts as a first response has disastrous results for the community of faith, as we all know, any of us who are older than kindergartners. Right? We've been in churches, communities, even families long enough to know what happens when we start the gossip mill and go around in circles. It's so obvious that the right thing to do is to go talk directly to the person rather than a third party, but that's pretty hard. It's obvious the right thing to do is to speak rather than keep it inside, but we also all know the consequences of keeping things inside. They fester. They become like a hardened stone inside of us. They grow, and they breed resentment, which is likely to come out sideways rather than directly when we least expect it. The direct approach is a very difficult discipline for Christians. The next step is, if you are not listened to, go find 1 or 2 other people and have a small conversation. Jesus doesn't say if that person agrees with you, just if they don't listen, if they don't have an open heart to hear your perspective and understand where you are coming from. And that open heart is pretty hard if you're on the receiving end of someone coming to you who perceives that you have sinned against them. The discipline for us is to always have an open heart, but it's pretty difficult to maintain that open-hearted listening presence if someone is coming at us with accusations. But indeed, that is the place to which Jesus calls us. And it's only if that person in the church who has upset you refuses to listen, to pay careful attention is what the Greek means. And that's why I say open-hearted, listening, not just hearing with your words, hearing the words, but paying close attention. If they don't listen even to the small group, then you can bring that incident to other members of the church. And Jesus doesn't say that they have to agree or that they have to do it your way, just that there's this open listening that is the basis for building and rebuilding relationships. And then here comes the kicker at the end, the moral of the story. You've done all the things right. You talked to the person directly. You brought some people, had a small group conversation. You told everybody in the church, and they still refused to listen. Let them be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So the final response, if the offender refuses to listen to the whole church, is for that person to become as a Gentile or tax collector. And the traditional interpretation of this final step is that it amounts to excommunication or shunning of that member who is engaged in the sinful behavior. However, if we look really closely at the words and the images that Jesus is using here, if we listen carefully, we see that he means something entirely different by this final step. Let that one be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Think for a minute how Jesus always treated Gentiles and tax collectors, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. He certainly didn't shun them. He didn't excommunicate them. There wasn't a church yet, so I guess he couldn't do that. They were the folk that he seemed most interested in breaking bread with and spending time with. If such a one becomes to you as a Gentile and a tax collector, might be Jesus' way of saying that that one is fertile ground for the work of reconciliation and transformation. That one is not punished or excommunicated. That one is rather seen as a lost sheep who needs to be found and brought back into the fold, if possible. Because, as Jesus goes on, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will also be set free in heaven. And so I would agree, of course, with those who claim that this passage in Matthew is about church discipline. But the discipline is not how we normally think of discipline. The discipline we are called to engage is not how to punish those who offend. This discipline is a discipline of forgiveness. God has given each and every Christian the power to forgive. And God expects that we exercise that power well. Those who can forgive here on earth, truly, the sins they forgive will be forgiven in heaven. And indeed, the more we bear forgiveness in our heart, the more we will experience that forgiveness in the life to come. And remember, in the midst of any conflict, wherever there are 2 or 3 gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. Amen.